Hey folks, so I'm in front of the Meadow House today and it is nearly finished. We're probably going to do a tour within the next 3 or 4 weeks, but we have some big ticket items that are outstanding that we need to do. And the first one is actually putting the gutters on the building. So you'll see that this is gutterless at the moment. We've had some heavy rains. This is a small roof system, so we don't get a tremendous amount of water that comes off the roof, but it's always a good a good choice to put some gutters on. After we do that, we'll probably get some rain chains, maybe some copper rain chains that go off to the side, and that will actually provide some interest and functionality. So we won't have any downspouts to deal with, but we will be assembling those rain chains. The next item that we're going to be focusing on is actually putting the storm door on the back of the house. So we actually have the front of the house pretty much finished. You could see that we have the doors in place, the locks, even the wreaths, even the details we have. And Sandra put on some crossbucks in the back as well, which really draws your eye into the door. Before this house, if you recall, it was just vinyl siding. It was more like a rectangle and it had zero interest on the outside of the house. So we added some of that depth and perspective and interest by adding the crossbucks, by adding the shed off to the north side, the chimney off to the south side, and adding the patio, and we're waiting on an awning as well. So that's one of the other items that we have to do, an awning on the back porch. That really gives a lot of depth and interest to this house, which it didn't have before. Working on the storm door, the gutters, and as I mentioned, the awning, that's actually something that we're getting custom made. So we were considering of actually doing the awning ourselves, but we like the idea of having this gentleman who's, I can't remember what part of the US he's in, but he makes these really beautiful kind of Bourbon Street like copper awnings, and we figured we'd get that for the back. And one of the annoying things, if we have a porch here, but one of the annoying things is if it's raining out and you're like running to the door and you're trying to put the key in and you're holding a bag of groceries and it's just raining on you. It's really nice to be able to step onto a covered patio or under an awning just to get in and get dry and maybe take off your shoes before you actually get into the house. So that's one thing that we really considered for this. And it's probably one of those final things that if we do a tour of the house, it's probably not going to be on the house quite yet, because I don't think we're going to be getting that until maybe November. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll get it before then, but I don't know. I'm not gonna bank on it. There's a lot of things that really tied us up with this house, supply chain issues, just indecisiveness, and then also doing a lot of the work ourselves. So as much as we would have loved to hire contractors for all aspects of the house, it doesn't mean that it'll get done on time. It doesn't mean it'll get done to the specs that you want, and it also means a lot more money. So we'd rather actually spend our time on it, take our time, learn how to do things and do things ourselves, and then blame ourselves if something doesn't turn out the way that we really wanted it. One of the fourth items that we're going to be working on and what I'm going to be really focusing on today is building a planter and trellis system for the back of the house. So that is one thing that I really wanted as part of the garden and landscaping for the Meadow House. I mean, this is a beautiful house that opens up to the meadow in the front of the house, and on the back of the house we wanted to create more of a perhaps a designed, maybe less wild garden system there. And it's the part of the house that actually faces the road as well. So it'll be something interesting for passersby to look at. We have a lot of folks that walk up and down the street, and I know they always like crane their head and look at the gardens and see how it's coming along. So it's really nice for them to be able to enjoy something that looks really nice too. And for the people living in the Meadow House or staying in the Meadow House to look outside and enjoy that. And one of those ideas was, as I'd mentioned, the planter box and the trellis system. And what I have envisioned was a planter box that really came off the side of the house. So it kind of looks like it was built in. And the trellis system would go up between these two windows, and we could have that for maybe a climbing rose or a climbing clematis, something of that nature. And then the planter box, you could plant some more of your perennial or annual, whatever you want, garden plants in. But we had to determine what the length and the width, the height and the depth would actually be for this planter box, particularly because we had to pour the patio on the back of the house as well. And what we discussed and determined is that we'd have to cut out a piece of the patio, or at least create a form that allowed for the planter box to fit into, because we didn't want the planter to be draining onto the concrete patio. So essentially we had to figure that out in advance before pouring the patio. And we were going to do a concrete patio, and Sandra was going to finish it with a micro cement topping to give it a nice color and to make it waterproof and to have it a little bit easier on the feet if you went out with like stocking feet or with bare feet. So we determined that length of it, and as Sandra is building the planter box, I feel like I completely misunderstood or underestimated the size of the planter box, because as he's assembling it, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is gonna fit so many plants. I mean, of course plants grow, but I was like, man, I'm gonna have to plant a lot of plants in order to be able to fill it. But what we determined is that, you know, I can't remember the length of it, but it would be about 18 inches high. So enough for, and we'll put an edge on it, so enough to put like a drink glass or to even like plant yourself on the side of it in order to have like another extra seat of sorts. And with the trellis system, the idea was to have it grow between these two windows. And one of the windows is actually the bathroom window. And what I envisioned is that, yes, it'll provide some interest and a utilitarian purpose of perhaps shielding some of the, if the plants grow up enough, maybe a little bit over the window, it'll actually shield and give a bit more privacy from that window that's in the bathroom. So that's something else that we figured. One thing to consider on any house, I think no matter if it's a stone house or a wood house or a vinyl house, is where you're actually going to grow those vines. And what we figured is that the trellis system will come off maybe 3 to 4 inches from the exterior wall of the house. And the reason for that is that vines could, especially like English ivy, for instance, could really damage the side of the house. And even on stone, but we're working with a board and batten siding. So if you recall, this actually used to be a vinyl siding. So we had removed that and put a stained board and batten hemlock siding. And we are going to make the trellis system still out of that stained wood, but we're going to have it, like I said, 3 to 4 inches off the exterior wall of the house. And so that way we could actually move the trellis system off the wall if we need to restain it, which we will, because this requires some maintenance in order to keep it looking good and keeping it functional. It also will prevent any vines from cracking into the wood. So the wood is going to be very vulnerable to that type of stuff. So that is something that we want to consider. The other thing that I really like is that if you create this trellis system off the side of your exterior wall, one of the ideas that I had and that I passed by Sonder is that if you could put a little platform behind there where the L brackets are to keep the trellis off the wall, probably like 4 inches, that's enough for a robin or a phoebe or a barn swallow potentially to make its nest. And we had a little platform that we put up at the common house, and we had a robin put 2 of her nests there and create 2 broods this past spring. So I think that would be really nice, and it'll be behind the privacy of some of those plants growing up. So I think that's something that a bird will really enjoy. I mean, obviously not everybody's going to want birds on the side of their house. You know, you will probably have excrement on your side of your house, but that's something that you could eventually scrape off after spring and just repaint that area. So I don't feel like that's big of a deal. I think it's really much nicer to be able to see some of the birds, you know, raise their broods on the side of the house. I like that kind of wildlife viewing, and knowing that the house is actually serving as habitat for wildlife around your area is like something really cool. So that's definitely something to consider. And one of the things that you would also want to consider is that we're crafting this planter and saying, okay, well, if we're going to make it out of wood, which we are, so we're basically we had to determine whether we're going to use some of the leftover board and batten, which is a wider board. I think it's like 8 inches or 10 inches wide with the boards behind me on the Meadow House, or are we going to use the leftover soffits, which are much thinner pine. So we ran a couple diagrams on Photoshop, maybe some 3D images, and eventually we determined that it'd be better to use the thinner boards because the wider boards just didn't look as good. We liked using the same color of the house. Like initially, Sandra had it as the cedar stain, but it kind of popped a little bit too much. And we went then with the color of the house, and that looked the best. And I think that's one of the things that where Photoshop and just making these mock-ups is so sensible and so smart so that you don't do the wrong thing and have to redo it. So I feel like we've eliminated a lot of the mistakes by just doing some of these mock-ups and saying, how does this feel? Does this look proportional to the house? Does this color look right? Is this board wide enough or does it need to be slimmer? Those are the things that I think actually really helped by doing some of those mock-ups. The last thing I say to consider with the building of this planter box, maybe the second to last thing, is that we didn't want the soil and the water to be touching the side of the house because you have this wooden exterior, and water and wood doesn't always mix, right? It's going to mold, it's going to deteriorate over time. So we're going to line the planter box with a plastic liner, and not the bottom of it, but just around the edges, so that it actually protects the planter, which is going to be made of wood, and it actually protects the back of the house as well. And then the planter box is going to sit just on the rim of the concrete patio, and then the hole is going to go down into the stone underlayment that's laid under the concrete. So it's just going to fit right in there perfectly, and then any of the water that drains down is going to drain into the stone by the house. And you want to make sure that you have decent drainage as well, because you don't want any of that water sitting up against the base of your house. So that is definitely something to consider. The other thing to consider is if you're doing a big planter box like we're planning on doing, eventually that soil is heavy. You're going to fit a lot of cubic footage of soil in that planter box, and that could eventually bow out the planter box and make it bloated essentially. And it might not happen in the first year or 2 years or 3 years, but as you keep on putting soil and compost and mulch and water in that, it may eventually start to balloon out. So Sandra is going to be putting these cross braces on the planter box in order to be able to basically keep it the same shape. So it's going to be a very strong planter box, and I would implore folks thinking about and considering about building these things to do it right the first time so that you don't have to actually do all these amendments over time. You don't want like the soil just be spilling out onto your patio system or anything along those lines. So yeah, that's going to be our plan. We're going to be building that. We'll show you some of the process along the way, and we're going to be planting it up before the end of fall, and we're really looking forward to taking you for a full comprehensive tour of the Meadow House very soon.